Random House's Silicon Valley Bleeding Edge Tour, and I'm going to introduce our panelists this evening. On my extreme left, we have Gary Rivlin, who's the author of The Plot to Get Bill Gates, which, to be summarized, would be Moby Dick in Silicon Valley, the true story of Bill Gates and those who would harpoon him in a humorous look into the meaning of the world's richest man and his rivals. Gary is an award-winning political reporter, author of Drive-By and Fire on the Prairie, Chicago's Harold Washington and the Politics of Race. Please welcome Gary Rivlin.
Thank you.
Poe Bronson is the author of Nudist on the Late Shift and two other novels. Nudist on the Late Shift is not a novel. These other two are novels. The first one was Bombardiers, which was a novel published in 1996 on the world of investment banking and the bond market. Also, his novel, The First $20 Million is Always the Hardest, which is in paperback, published in 1997, about the computer biz in the heart of Silicon Valley. Nudist on the Late Shift is a story of the new gold rush told through a series of vignettes featuring the eccentric, the entrepreneurial, and the engineering spirit of the place. Amy Harmon of the New York Times calls him the Valley's own Tom Wolfe. Please welcome Poe Bronson. And Kara Swisher is the author of AOL.com. It's her first book. While writing for the Washington Post, she was the first journalist granted access to AOL's Virginia headquarters. She broke news about AOL's dealings with Bill Gates, Paul Allen, and the Christian right, and the merger with Netscape. She currently covers Silicon Valley and other high-tech issues for the Wall Street Journal. Please welcome Kara Swisher. And tonight's moderator will be Mr. Rivlin.
Good evening. So this is our 7th of 7 cities on the Silicon Valley Bleeding Edge Tour. And the question always comes up, what is the Bleeding Edge Tour? After a while, it starts to sound like this cross between Into Thin Air and Hannibal. But let me instead try to explain it by giving a story. I was doing an interview with a man named Mitchell Kurtzman. He was formerly CEO of Sybase. And we were talking about Scott McNealy, one of the big stars in Silicon Valley, the CEO of Sun Microsystems. And they're friends, and he was wondering, God, can McNealy make it among the sharks? Could he make it among those he called, like Bill Gates and Larry Ellison, cold-blooded killers? And he stops himself, and he goes, oh, God, I'm sorry. I really don't mean to be criticizing a friend. And I look at him, and he looks at me, and we just start laughing. It's like, what a strange world it is that you have to apologize for implying that a friend of yours is not a cold-blooded killer. So tonight we're just going to be talking about this strange and fascinating world. I'm going to talk for a few minutes, then Poe's going to talk for a few minutes about what his book is about, and then Kara. Then we'll debate a little bit among ourselves and then open it up to questions. Let me start off, though, before my presentation by telling you about the difference, a story that underscores the difference between Bill Gates and the rest of us. It was the fall of 1997, and the federal government had just hit Microsoft with a suit alleging antitrust violations. Maybe the worst day of Bill's life, the head of PR for Microsoft told me. I was curious, so I checked the business pages. On maybe the worst day of Bill Gates' life, he made $152 million. Now me, I'm probably like most of you. Short of something tragic happening in my family or to a close friend, no day I make $150 million on Wall Street is one of the worst days of my life. See, but it's not about the money with Bill Gates. I mean, that's what Microsoft PR tells you. It's about great software. Right. Never mind the $50 million home or the $21 million airplane or the $32 million he spent outbidding the government of Italy for one of Da Vinci's notebook. Never mind, too, that the first time he took a look at the machine, he saw dollar bill signs, while the other kids in the 8th grade class were trying to figure out how to put tic-tac-toe on the machine. He was trying to figure out businesses. He started 3 businesses before he was the age of 18. Or consider that he dropped out of Harvard because he saw a key money-making opportunity falling through his fingers. Or consider the deal he made with Paul Allen, his childhood friend. Paul Allen is actually the one who came up with the idea that led to the product that gave rise to Microsoft. The two worked on it as hard as one another, but somehow Gates convinced Allen that he, Gates, deserved a 60% share of the company. And then he convinced him he deserved a 64% share of the company because Gates had dropped out of Harvard and Paul Allen had only dropped out of Washington State. So why does our culture worship Bill Gates? I mean, when the media conducts polls asking Americans to name the people they most admire, why does Bill Gates always end up among the top 10? He's humorless, he's narrow-minded, he's arrogant, he's abusive to underlings, he's a screamer and cruel. I love the story of one time, 15 minutes into a meeting, he saw a new woman employee and he goes, "Why the F did we hire you?" He's so competitive that he and his wife, for relaxation, buy his and her jigsaw puzzles to see who can finish first. He's hailed as this technological innovator, this Edison of our time, but he's really invented nothing. To put it charitably, he's a gifted imitator. He has the appetite of a killer whale, the instincts of a velociraptor, and the super neato vocabulary of a teenager. He says he has no time to give away all that money, but he's also found the time in the 90s to start several other corporations, including Corbis, which goes around buying up the rights to electronic imagery like photographs and famous paintings, because the guy understands a money-making opportunity when he sees it. I did a long interview with one of his lieutenants who had done a lot of negotiating on Gates' behalf. And he was talking about how he was always blindsiding people. He called it Machiavellian poker. Like, even when he'd be negotiating with close partners, they'd be withholding information. Because Bill Gates doesn't believe in win-win situations. He believes in situations in which Microsoft wins. I think kind of Dennis Miller cut close to the truth when he said that Bill Gates is a monocle and a white Persian cat away from the perfect villain in a James Bond movie. Or maybe Larry Ellison, who says it's Bill Gates versus humanity. And right now, folks, humanity is the underdog. So in my book, I write about the government joining the plot to get Bill Gates, and I write about Ralph Nader and Orrin Hatch and groups like SPOGE, the Society to Prevent Gates Getting Everything. But mainly I write about the Ahabs, those who grow so obsessed with the great white whale from Redmond that they can think about nothing else. Many of the companies end up about as well as Ahab did. They cast themselves as heroes, but why? I look at Scott McNeely, the CEO of Sun, one of the key Ahabs, and he admits that he only wishes the government would accuse him, like Gates, of being a monopolist. Or Larry Ellison, from the mid-'80s through the early '90s, he declared to anyone who asked him that Genghis Khan was his management guru. Genghis Khan is the one who said it's not enough to beat a foe, you need to destroy them. So what drives these Ahabs, as far as I'm concerned, are greed, rivalry, and resentment. I mean, Larry Ellison hears that Bill Gates is here building a $30 million house, so he just announces he's going to build a $40 million house. His great invention in 1995, his next great thing, is a dumbed-down machine called a network computer that he later admits he came up with because he was jealous of all the time in the media Bill Gates was getting. Ellis and McNeely, they're both jealous of all the time Gates gets in the media. They're talking with their PR people, they're always saying, why is Bill Gates getting the cover and I'm not? McNeely once called up the Wall Street Journal Little Billy Big Bucks. That's what he told the reporter. Little Billy Big Bucks says it, and it's news. To me, the perfect quote was from a young woman I interviewed who was a marketing executive at both Oracle and Sun. Some very wealthy little boys are fighting each other, and we're just their pawns. Sometimes the picture is no prettier than a kindergarten food fight.
Well, I think Gary writes very, very pointedly about how we should not worship these CEOs that have these huge stock valuations. And that said, then what is left for us as writers to do? And I believe that it is indeed even the moral responsibility to write and for me to find the people who do excite me. Some writers have what they call a bullshit detector, and I think Gary's got that. I have what I call a goosebump meter. And that means that if I didn't hear goosebumps hearing someone's story, I threw their notes in the trash. Let me read the legal note alone from my book. This is just the legal note. I'm going to give you kind of a sense of the kind of characters that are in my book. The individual identified here as Michael Zilli was freely open on the record about his unusual manner of funding his startup venture, growing marijuana and selling it wholesale, until he got a job with a respectable corporation and did not want his background to catch up to him. In a similar dynamic, the individual identified here as John/David Foster retroactively requested a pseudonym for himself and his employer only when the latter ran into unexpected financial difficulty. In exchange for pseudonymity, the Oracle salesperson identified as Mars Garo allowed me to pose as his assistant while we made his rounds without requesting permission from his superiors. The individual identified as Claudia Gomez asked for a pseudonym since lying about one's identity in order to trick receptionists into giving out employee names might be viewed as fraudulent behavior. The individual identified as B, who had developed an intricate plan to murder one of his co-workers, asked that I not use his name for obvious reasons. The question I get most often is, how do I get people like that to talk to me? And I think it's really simple, because I value what they have to say. And my philosophy is that everyone's experience does paint the picture, and I value people from the top to the bottom. If that means I'm going to spend weeks with people that I'm under a secrecy agreement that I can't even write about it, that's fine. If that means I'm going to sleep in the car, if it means I'm going to go on the road for 8 weeks, I'll do whatever it takes, because I'm interested in the authenticity of that experience. That gives me the vantage point from which I write. Really, I'm a writer. My role models are not Bill Gates and Steve Case and Jerry Yang. My role models are people who write about pioneering and people moving to California, Upton Sinclair and John Steinbeck and Joan Didion. And this is a place about which I am ultimately just really curious and endlessly curious. I don't really have conclusions as much as I have hypotheses that I endlessly test and retest, continuing to find out whether what is most important is true. Silicon Valley is an incredibly diverse place. And to be a writer, to write about it, you can find any kind of story you want to find. And if you go there and you write and you think that you didn't find anybody who had a soul there, I think it's probably because you didn't have your soul there. If you think everyone was in it for the money, it was because you couldn't see past the money. If you think everyone was heroic, it was because you felt heroic. If you think everything was insanely great, it was because you thought it was all insanely great. I was interested in people who were in pursuit of unusual lives and nothing else. Thank you.
I'm going to keep it short. This is something Bill Gates didn't get. And in fact, in the future, I think it's going to be increasingly a world of things that Bill Gates and big companies like Microsoft don't get. Because right now I cover the internet for the Wall Street Journal, which I think is the most significant communications medium created yet. Covering it is a really exciting time, because what's happening is giant companies are being made irrelevant. Not only didn't Microsoft get AOL, neither did Disney, neither did Time Warner, neither did AT&T. That's a very significant thing to say, because right now companies like AOL and Yahoo are being mentioned in the same breath as giant companies. Here in Austin, you have the example of Dell Computer Corporation, which many years ago wouldn't have been discounted because of IBM and some other companies that were giants. The fact that a company like Dell could become so gigantic and so influential in such a short a time is a significant thing that's happening for all of us in this nation. Because now, with the internet and with the advent of the internet, companies like AOL and Amazon and Yahoo and all the other companies you've read about and heard about can be created almost out of thin air and rise to prominence and importance in a way that I think is going to profoundly affect our society going forward. It's a time when the average person, and not everybody can, but the average person with entrepreneurial zest and spirit can begin to create something that they never were able to before. The internet allows people, previously, for example, you wouldn't have been able to start a network without having $1 zillion. You wouldn't have been able to start a publishing company. You wouldn't have been able to start a Hollywood studio. The internet negates all that. People can create radio stations. They can create broadcast networks on the internet. They can create publishing without having any permission from any powers that be. On the consumer side, people can get information about prices and health care and anything else they want in a way that they were never able to before. Companies like AOL have been created because the vast majority of the mass market has finally stepped forward and said, we want to take control of a lot of this process, and we want to remove gatekeepers, and we want to remove the experts that have so long sort of sat on top of society like lard on chicken soup, and has been able to sort of create this giant worldwide conversation that is only going to get bigger and only going to get significant as we move forward. So I think it's very important for everybody to understand what's happening here and how it's going to affect their lives, and if they want to be part of it, how they can be part of it. And when I started writing the book, AOL.com, I went into Random House. It was sort of significant. It says how Steve Case made millions in the war for the web. Well, he's right now worth billions. I went into Random House to write the book, and they said, AOL, isn't that going out of business? This was in 1996. Today, it stands astride the online world like the dominant company that it is. This has happened with innumerable companies, and I think it's time to sort of acknowledge that the internet is about to create the corporations for the next millennium. And I think it's important to start to understand why and what it's going to mean for a lot of people. Gary?
So before we actually start debating, let me just kind of toss out a softball. Why don't each of us talk about a favorite interview or scene that helps captures the essence of our books. Either of you like to start?
Yeah, I'll start with my first meeting with Steve Case, which these guys have heard several times. I was covering retail for the Washington Post in the early 90s, which was a really good thing to cover because there was a lot of companies going bankrupt, and it was a very active beat. And I had gone off to visit some friends in Russia, and I got contacted by my editor, who said, would you come back? We'd like you to cover this internet thing that's happening. And this is 1994, late 1994, which is about 5 years ago, or less than 5 years ago. And I sort of scrunched my face, and I said, you mean like email or something like that? And they said, yeah, email. That's what we want you to cover. There's this very small company called America Online. It's out in Vienna, Virginia, behind a car dealership. It's probably going to go out of business. Microsoft is getting in the business next year, and it'll probably put them out of business. And I said, oh, all right. And I came back to Washington, D.C., and I drove out to Vienna, Virginia. I drove behind the car dealership, and I arrived at the office of a man named Steve Case, which is off to the side of the receptionist. You could see it right from the glass doors. And he's sitting there at a crappy old desk with some really old computers, and he's tapping away at a Macintosh and a Windows computer. And I sat down with him. He's a very shy person, which some people mistake for aloofness and arrogance. And I said, okay, what's your plan? What's your business plan? And he said, I'm going to be the biggest communications company in history. I'm going to be as big as AT&T, and someday maybe I'll buy AT&T. And I said, really? I said, and I'm the queen of Siam. And I didn't say that. And I said, really? That's a big job. Could you settle for something just like a little smaller, like not going out of business because you're kind of out of money? And he said, no, I'm going to be gigantic. You don't understand what's happening here. This is a gigantic worldwide medium of which the old companies do not understand and will not dominate. And I'm going to be at the top of that heap. And I said, I don't mean to be rude, and it's probably a bad way to start off a relationship, but I think you're crazy. And he said, well, one of the first things I'm going to do when I'm really rich is I'm going to buy the Washington Post, and I'm going to fire you. So he could buy the Washington Post many times over today.
When Sabir Bhatia sold Hotmail to Microsoft for $400 million, December 31st, 1997, I thought, what a lucky guy. Just dumb luck. Right place, right time. I mean, nobody's worth $400 million after just a couple years of work. I mean, under no terms does that really seem fair. And I just really thought that, it seemed the pinnacle of this example of the kind of thing where you look at people and you think they haven't done anything, and it makes you almost dislike and not really find the heroics in their experience. But when I have that kind of a sentiment, it seemed like such a good example. I would go down, and I thought even maybe I would go defraud this guy, and I would find out that, in fact, he was just an ordinary guy. I went down to meet him, and he said, I am an ordinary guy. I'm just an ordinary guy. Anybody can do it. You can do it. I can do it, too. But then I began to discover some things that were not so ordinary at all about what he had done. He had arrived here from India 10 years ago with just $250 in the pocket, which was all that his country let him take out of that country. He had passed the Caltech transfer exam. He'd been the only student in the world to pass it that year. When he was so believed in his idea that he had the toughness to continue to pursue his project, even though he'd been turned down by 21 venture capitalists. And at the 22nd venture capitalist, he finally found someone who was willing to offer him $300,000. And he was so excited. Look at this place. He would talk about it. Look at this place. Anybody can do it. I had no software experience. He'd been a hardware engineer. I'd never managed anybody. I'd never raised any money before. I'd never even bought a car in this country before. And some man I've just met is offering me $300,000. Where else in history, where else in this world could that sort of story happen? And so he was, again, arguing this point. Anybody can do it. He was lucky. But then I learned that when they offered him $300,000, they offered him that for 30% of the company, a very standard thing. And even though that was a 22nd venture capital firm, he turned around and walked out the door on them and said no, because he only wanted it to sell them 15% of his company. And sure enough, the venture capitalist caved. You know, what young entrepreneur has the guts to do that, to walk out on that? And similar situations continue to occur as you develop that company, including when Bill Gates came calling and offered them something like $50 million, and then 60, and then 70, and at some point it just becomes like monopoly money, because who knows, these figures don't mean anything to you, but he believed he had an incredibly great product that was going to grow from the 4 million users at the time to more. And by the time they did sell the company for $400 million, he was able to talk Microsoft up to that price over 4.5 months, continually saying no, the way Steve Case said no to Bill Gates, but they kept coming back and are knocking on the door and being there again. And I realized he had done something great. There had been a point in time when he had turned down the offer for $350 million, when every single person on his board and every single person in his company said, please accept the offer, I want my future guaranteed. He was the only one, and he still held out. And when that's what it takes to make $400 million. It's kind of perverse. You have to be willing to say no to $350 million. And I think it's amazing, not just that someone could do that, but that someone could come here from another country and have that kind of social mobility in such a short period of time. And that's what really excites me.
So Microsoft likes to buy companies, but they don't like to license software technology. But in the fall of 1995, they really didn't have a choice. Sun Microsystems had come up with the Java programming language, and the Netscape Navigator, their browser, was taking advantage of it, and Microsoft understood that they needed to take advantage of it. So Microsoft, being Microsoft, they pretended that they were mildly interested in this technology, but of course they were very interested, and eventually there was a negotiating session down in Menlo Park, where Sun is located. So there was a team of Microsoft deal makers, and there was a team from Sun, but they're also connected to another member of the Sun team, a co-founder named Bill Joy. He was in Denver. He lives, in Aspen. He lives in Aspen, and he was connected via speakerphone. Now, Bill Joy is one of the giants of computerdom. If you're going to start a computer hall of fame, Bill Joy is going to be one of your first 10 members in it. He's one of the gods of the Unix world. And the Microsoft team was really looking forward to meeting him, but then listening to him as part of it. But it kept on happening during negotiations that Bill Joy would enter and suddenly be just a series of invectives. He'd just be cursing, cursing, cursing. See, because Joy, he's kind of like John Updike, right? I mean, he writes really elegant programs, and he's respected among the real, the highbrow set. And Bill Gates is like John Grisham, in contrast. Just cranks it out, but people like it, people use it. He's making a lot of money, and there's a lot of resentment from Joy. So it would just be, I don't know why we're talking to Bill Gates and his company. They said it got so intense that eventually they kept on hearing like this popping noise, and they're wondering what it was, and they realized it was the spittle coming out of his mouth, bouncing off the phone, magnified by that little speakerphone contraption. So I decided right then and there, I got to go interview Bill Joy. I mean, I'm writing a book about, envy of Gates or dislike of Gates, and some people were saying that Bill Joy is #1 when it comes to hating, if not disrespecting, Bill Gates. So we meet at a restaurant in San Francisco, and I think he might be the smartest person I ever interviewed. It was kind of intimidating talking to this guy, but it was mostly a fun conversation. We were talking about the old days of Sun. He was one of the 4 founders of Sun Microsystems, and telling me stories about how they had to ask somebody to go up to Scott McNealy shortly into his tenure as CEO and say, Scott, like, you ought to lose the golf pants. Like, I know you're from a preppy background, but most of the rest of the world doesn't really believe plaid is the way you live every day of your life. So we're kind of laughing, but I realized, oh God, I gotta bring this up. I gotta see the bear, right? And so Bill, do you ever get referred to as the other Bill? Conversation changes completely. The clouds come in, the face is all dark, and he starts cursing, and I swear there was spittle coming out, and it's just like, okay, that story is confirmed. So do one of you two want to throw a question?
Well,
you want me to throw?
I want to ask you one, Gary. This is one we haven't.
Seems like he's storing that one up and just waiting.
Yeah, it's the seventh night, and it's time to ask you this one. I don't want your prediction for what Judge Thomas Penfield Jackson is going to decide in the Microsoft case. I want to know, if you were him, you looked at that evidence, what would you, no, I don't want your prediction, I want, what would you decide? And if you were to find Microsoft guilty, how would you remedy the situation?
Happy to answer the first part. The second part is much tougher, but I'll give it a crack because I might even think of an answer by then. So let's separate out that antitrust law is the kind of law that even most attorneys are intimidated by. It's very arcane. It's kind of, unless you practice it full time, you really don't quite understand it. So let's use rules of evidence, kind of public opinion. So Judge Jackson is the one who signed the consent decree in 1995, kind of basically rubber stamped it. Microsoft comes in with this refiling. That what occurred is that the government said that Microsoft was in violation of that consent decree. That was the first of 2 suits in the recent years filed against them. And Microsoft's attorneys come in and say, hey, as far as we read this consent decree, it lets us bundle a ham sandwich of Windows if we like. So I'm thinking, that's pretty arrogant. I signed that thing. And you're telling me it's pretty meaningless here. They come, he orders them, on his own actually, the government didn't ask, to bundle this machine to offer people a choice between Windows with the browser and Windows without, and they just kind of do the equivalent of a surgeon saying, okay, we've taken out the appendix, but not because they were in order to stitching the guy back up. So then it just becomes like this little battle between the judge and Microsoft. So I'm going through and I'm feeling, this is a pretty arrogant company right here. And looking at the evidence, look at it from Netscape's point of view. Other than downloading the browser off their intranet site, there's basically 2 ways to get this thing out there. One is loaded on machines, yet Microsoft won't permit any of the big companies like Dell or Compaq to bundle the Windows operating system with the Netscape Navigator. In fact, Compaq had already cut a deal and was doing it with Netscape, and Microsoft said, sure, go ahead and do it, but you can no longer sell Windows. Look at the internet service providers. That's the other channel through which Netscape could get users. They came up with a list of their top 10 internet service providers and just twisted arms until they popped out of the socket.
So get on to the remedy, Gary.
What would you do?
I'd fight
What would you do?
I'd fight against them. I think the most provocative remedy is not to break the operating system part of the company from the applications part of the company, but to me, break it into several baby bills, let's say. Break it into 3 or 4 or 5 Microsofts, each of which has ownership of Windows, each of which has ownership of Office applications, and let Microsoft compete among itself. But I also don't think that's going to happen, but that's personally what I would be advocating.
Do you care to take a crack at what you would do if you were the judge looking at that evidence? You've had a very interesting perspective.
I think that at this point, I mean, Microsoft is arguing this, but I think it's irrelevant because I think time has passed it by. Netscape has been sold off to AOL. It hardly exists anymore. The damage has been done, and actually, the internet is of great danger to Microsoft, no matter what shape they're in. There is as much as powerful as Microsoft is going to be, its efforts in the interactive arena have been weak. They in no way dominate the internet. Nobody I cover on the internet is scared of Microsoft, and then sometimes they laugh at some of the efforts that have happened. And I know the old argument that companies like Microsoft, when they come back the 3rd time, this time they're going to get it. Well, this has been like the 9th time, and they aren't going to get it. And it may be a very similar situation to IBM and the personal computer. I think very exciting companies like Dell, which faces its own challenges, very major challenges because of the internet. Very exciting young nimble companies are the companies of the future, and if you can't change quickly, you're in big trouble. And if I was Microsoft, I'd almost want to be broken up so that I could get more of the entrepreneurial spirit back into the company that it originally had. I think they're saddled by the bigness of themselves.
And, you know, we've seen this talk about tracking stocks lately. Isn't one of the big factors of tracking stocks just that you can recruit people, who are going to have a stock that's going to be able to go up with where the internet stocks
one of the
go up.
things that's been perplexing to companies like Microsoft and Disney and Time Warner is that these stocks of Yahoo and America Online and other variety of internet companies, even some really dumb ones, they go up like crazy on the first day of trading, and they stay up, and they make instant billionaires of a bunch of 12-year-olds, and it's very disturbing, I would think, if I was working my butt off for 20 years to see this happening. What's happening within the companies, and Disney is a very good example of it, is that they own, Michael Eisner is the boss. Now, he happens to be very wealthy, but there's the boss of the person who monitored InfoSeek, which is what Disney has been attempting to make into an internet company. I mean, it is an internet company, into their internet company. The guy who manages, the guy who runs InfoSeek, is 20 times poorer than him. Now, that's a really interesting situation. And in fact, you know, some of the minor producers are richer than the guy who is their ultimate boss. It's a very disturbing situation. So what a lot of these companies are doing is they're trying to pull out all their internet assets. Disney has a bunch of them, Disney.com, Daily Blast, you know, stuffedanimals.com, whatever. And they're trying to stick them into an internet company, send them all out there to you investors and say, hey, we're an internet company. Well, you know what? You're not an internet company. You're a bunch of pieces of internet companies without any kind of cogent plan to become a business. So I'm wary of I'm always wary of tracking stocks because it looks like it's just trying to take advantage of investor euphoria. So that's what I think. I don't think much of internet tracking.
Do you want to answer
stocks.
that question, Poe, about Microsoft?
Okay. I would make baby bills out of it. I would carve it up inside. Every baby bill would get the operating system, and the key question would be really Windows NT as to whether every baby bill would get that. And one would be an internet-focused baby bill, and one would be all the other add-on software, Office, that kind of thing. And I'd break it up into about 5, but you'd have competition amongst them in the operating system market. The alternative to that is to sort of make the operating system free. And I would find them guilty on all counts in every way. And that's from also having worked for a long time with, I worked for 5 years with the lawyer who broke up AT&T. And that's from a long time studying that law and understanding exactly what went on there. So that's the way I'd handle it.
So it was Bill in the drawing room with a knife, basically.
Yeah.
One of the reoccurring things as we're traveling around is Microsoft, and clearly the 800-pound gorilla, if not 10,000-pound gorilla of the software world, but their influence and potential influence into the future in the internet. And we've been disagreeing. I mean, I certainly Microsoft has problems, certainly on that front, and certainly Microsoft has had its share of missteps, but I think it'd be a mistake to count Microsoft out. You look at e-commerce, and yeah, though they have some efforts there with real estate and some other things, they're really getting outshined by the Amazons, etc. of the world. But to me, the internet is more than that. It's browsers, it's NT servers, it's the underlying software. And I just see them playing such a huge role. They've got $22 billion. They've bought nearly 100 companies in the last 5 years. They'll keep on buying companies. They're into everything. And the reason Gates wins so much is he's got a bet on every horse. It's, you know, satellite and wireless internet connection, or maybe it's cable. It doesn't make a difference. He owns pieces of companies and not companies outright. So I just see them playing a huge role. They own they have a deal with NBC, so they're into cable. They have a potentially really popular site with MSNBC. So we've been disagreeing all along this trip with the significance. Microsoft has done very well in life, having people underestimate them, but they just chase the taillights really, really well.
Well, there's an issue of but they were relevant in the past 5 years ago. The question is a question of relevance. I think what's interesting is that not Microsoft, but it's the same issue faced by companies like Dell and computer makers. Is where is your relevance in this new food chain that's forming? Right now, look at the television. Is the television the power point in the house. No, it's the whoever broadcasts over it. It literally you could televisions are what, $12 a piece now. Computers, this whole free PC movement. I don't care what you say. It is a very giant threat to computer makers, and if it continues, it's even worse. It's even worse for them. So, I mean, in the television paradigm, the powerful people are the networks, the people who compile and aggregate and send out information. That is where the power is. The powerful people in the telephone business are not the people. It's, again, telephones. What do they cost? 10 cents now. Cell phones, perfect. The people that are in power, the people that deliver the services. And therefore, the internet is a perfect vehicle for this, because it puts a company like Yahoo in a giant position, even though they hardly own anything. They don't make anything. They don't. There's nothing physical. If you went and closed down Yahoo, you'd have a lot of desks. A slide or two, because all these internet companies have to have a slide in them. You'd have, a lot of T-shirts and some computers, but not much else. And I think that's a very significant thing.
Kara, can you talk about what it was like in Virginia? What was that culture like there? I mean, we're here in Austin. We've been around the country. Even if it's just in comparison to here in the Silicon Valley, what was the culture of Vienna or Dulles, Virginia like?
Well, one good thing, right now AOL has moved its headquarters from Vienna to Dulles, and I call it Dullest. It's a perfect name. Next door is a Walmart, and that would be the entire place where AOL is located. And I think that is a good thing, because, as I've said many times before, if AOL had been located in Silicon Valley, it was a company widely derided by many, many people on the internet constantly. And to this day, they continue to insult them. Now they're losers, but like they won. That's kind of how they look at them. I don't believe they won, but they're losers still. And it's sort of like, you wish you lost so much. So I think being in Vienna and Dulles was a very important critical element to companies like Dell, like Amazon, like Microsoft, because at least in AOL's case, if they had been going to the same bars, everyone when you work in an area, like Hollywood has 12 different restaurants everybody goes to. Silicon Valley, it's a very similar kind of thing. If they had lived in Silicon Valley when everybody was insulting them, they would have never made the decisions they made. They would have added a lot of crap onto the service. They would have made it more complex. They wouldn't have they would have not listened to the consumers as much. They would have been into push technology, for example, which was a big deal out in Silicon Valley a couple of years ago. And I remember when Case was, I was talking about push technology, and he said, push is just a feature, who cares? And he was able to say that because he wasn't having lunch with everybody at El Fornillo and Palo Alto saying, push, yes, that's the way to go. And I think it really helps him. And one of the things that he said very early on to me was like, I find out what the elite people are doing, and I do the opposite. And then I succeed. So
That's interesting. My perspective, because I live in San Francisco and I spent all my time down the valley, and because I write for Wired magazine, which had a sort of the elitist attitude towards technology, that more complicated and fancier and bigger graphics are better, that San Francisco was far more elitist than the Valley itself, that it was very important that the Valley was 30 miles from the cultural center, and that people in Silicon Valley had little else to do at night but to go back to the work. And I thought that was actually very crucial to its development. It is changing right now, as Kara says, there are the restaurants, there are the parties, but
of course,
still...
we talk about the internet at the parties, so
right.
It's not like good for us.
But people in San Francisco are far more cynical, and I think they're cynical because those people who are working 80-hour weeks are very aware of what they're giving up at night. In San Francisco, you're giving up a lot of culture. You're giving up going to see music, you're going to see people, you're going to see good restaurants and just interesting life. And down the Valley, they're not giving up much. To me, the great metaphor for the Valley, and maybe it sounds like it kind of applies to Virginia, it was those companies that offer lunch at their corporate cafeteria, that the lunch has to be just good enough that you don't leave the building and go to the city to get your lunch, but not so good that you didn't quickly grow distasteful of it, and so you'd go back to your cubicle. And I think Silicon Valley, for me, what I've seen is that concept taken to the level of a whole town, which is to say that Mountain View is just interesting enough that the people who come out of their cubicles can find, a place to eat, but not, but then it's going to make them turn around and go back to work at night. It's interesting for me being here. and seeing Austin, and seeing the entrepreneurial culture here and the number of startups, and I can kind of maybe describe a little bit. I think it's going to grow tremendously, and it's a great place to do business. And maybe I can tell you a little bit about, I think, what I see where you're headed, because at the same time that Fortune magazine may rank Austin as the place to do business, Fortune magazine builds a bureau out in Palo Alto. And at the same time as Forbes magazine writes an article saying this is the hot startup town, Forbes magazine builds a building next to the 101 freeway in Silicon Valley. I think that we have, in terms of the different elements that come into play in a culture, the one of the ones that actually is not as significant here is press. That the sort of national hype and national publications have come to Silicon Valley, and they probably ought to be coming here a lot more. And the other is venture capital. What I hear from lots of entrepreneurs who are here, and what I've seen is we have about 10x the venture capital that comes here. And that is, it gets so crazy amongst venture capitalists that they are just nearly killing each other for deals, hot deals that come up, and there are hot deals every day. And one venture capitalist, famous venture capitalist, committed suicide probably over the fact that he didn't get in on a hot deal. And when you have that kind of pressure amongst venture capitalists for what entrepreneurs are doing, then you really have an open market, and you really have a chance for excitement. And every company in Silicon Valley, every large company, has its own venture capital fund. So we're not just talking about Sand Hill Road venture capitalists, we're talking about a lot of money pouring in.
Well, let's talk about the money, because it's one issue, and then we'll open it up for questions, I think would be good. One of the things we've discussed lately is the idea that there's just too much money flowing into this area, and there's going to be a lot of really bad deals happening because of it. There's too much money flowing to the startups initially, there's too much money in the IPO market, there's too much funding, and therefore people can't have the ability to make giant mistakes with all this cash. Recently, for example, a company called Petopia, which was the fourth rank. There's like 10 pet companies right now competing, all of them fully funded with at least $10 million. Now, I don't know how you can't do well with $10 million. It just got $65 million. Now, if you can't succeed, you know, with $65 million, I'd like to take you on the back and hit you on the head and not let you open a business the rest of your life. I get calls from companies. An antique watch company called me up and said, you know, I just got $25 million to run my antique watch company. It's astonishing and disturbing at the same time. There are very small companies that start up with, Poe just wrote about one, 4 and 5 people that are instantly funded at valuations of $200 to $300 million without having one sale. And I think it's really important to sort of start to think about what impact that will have, because what happens is when it moves to the IPO market, it's got to be an even bigger splash, and it's got to be a bigger splash and a bigger splash. And at some point, it's going to be a lot of splashing and sinking, I think.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about most venture capitalists is most are relatively new to the industry. They've come in the last 5 or 8 or less years. And they don't understand that there's been ups and downs. I mean, in the 80s, there were terrible times. A lot of venture funds went out. So there's this race where they're slapping down bets as fast as they can. It's working, right? I mean, 95, 96, the mistake would have been to take your time and really check under the hood. And you know, meanwhile, while you're doing that, they got funding from someone else. There's a man named Paul Sappho, really well-respected observer in Silicon Valley. And his quote to me is, there's more money than rat holes to shove it down. I mean, it's not only venture money. I mean, you got Japanese money and old money and dumb money and corporate money and just money raining down. And there'll be some amazing successes. I mean, as Kara said, like, you've got that much money. There are going to be some companies that really, really soar, but there's going to be some equally fabulous failures. And it's going to be really interesting to watch that as well.
Well, what I fear, because I do see so much money coming in, the average venture capital firm in Silicon Valley has, in the last 10 years, has multiplied by 4 the number of people who work there, the number of partners that have the money to spend. But the amount of money they have to spend has gone up by 40. So far, to the point that venture capitalists on Sand Hill Road do not talk about return on capital. They talk about return on time invested. They feel that they can't afford to give money away in $1 and $2 and $3 million increments. They've got to give it away in $5 and 10 and $20 million increments. And the fear for me is I spent a tremendous amount of time this spring watching what new ideas were coming down the pipe in their offices, and it was all e-commerce. And so it's very wrong to think that all these ideas are getting funded. E-commerce ideas are getting funded. We were in Boston on Tuesday night. I went out with the MIT Entrepreneurs Club. That's a grand tradition there of taking real risks and building things that may change what's going to happen way down the road. And they're still building things there. They're not just all doing .coms and not just all programming in HTML. And it was amazing. I met this one guy, Greg Favalora, who had created what in effect is a 3D monitor, and it's kind of hard to describe here rather than it's a box, but he had a clear globe, and he had a three-dimensional projection like a hologram inside this thing. And
Cool.
It was extremely cool. And not only that, he's got great people in his company. He's got all his engineers working for Equity. He's got, as a temporary CEO, the former head of SGI's U.S. sales division, and he has as a chairman of his board Rob Ryan, the founder of Ascent Communications, who can open up venture capitalists' door for him and with no trouble. And he did go to the venture capitalists this spring and this winter, and they said, wow. And they said, great team. And then they said, but we're only doing .coms. And it's really, something is broken in the system when too much money is chasing just the .coms and other incredibly interesting technology. Now, he's not going to have any trouble. I mean, he's got angel funding or corporate partners or something, but those kind of projects are not being seen by the venture capitalists. So particularly as a public consciousness, it's important not to think venture capitalists are taking care of all these ideas.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, Martha Stewart, for example, just got a gigantic amount of money to deal with her website right now. And I literally said, hey, that's a good idea. I actually was like, and I'm thinking, Martha Stewart, what in the world does she have to do with the internet? And in fact, she just got a giant investment to do internet stuff. I mean, it is gotten to the point of almost lunacy. Walt Mossberg, who writes a column for the Journal called Personal Technology, which is very popular, and I have a little game where we make up web companies in front of venture capitalists. And literally, we made up one which we called Passages, that his dad had just died, and we said, oh, we'll put up people's memorials on the websites, and then when they get divorced, they can put them up, and when they get married, they can put them up, and it'll be the place where people. We just were completely throwing out all these terms, making it up. $10 million they wanted to give us to do it. And just recently, and we were like, no, absolutely not. We were sort of, everyone's like, why did you, my mother's like, why did you take it? We're like, because, it's a big fat lie. But they, just recently, a company has gotten funded that is funerals online, which is,
Funny world. So let's open it up to questions. And do us one favor, stand up, please, and wait for the gentleman to come over with the boom mic.
If you have questions. This is for C-SPAN, which is going to be broadcast we don't know when.
I just wanted to get your opinions on what effect you think that the impending move towards broadband and internet showing up on smartphones and PDAs has had, since both AOL and Microsoft have had a few missteps there. The
Absolutely.
AOL Anywhere movement hasn't really gone anywhere yet.
Well, they just announced it.
Well, yeah, but they're still a little bit farther behind than, say, AT&T, and Windows CE is really thus far paling in comparison to the Palm OS. So what are your views on how that'll progress over the next few years?
Well, the Palm thing is another example of Microsoft not being able to prevail. They threw out those CE devices like crazy. I mean, you could I could build a house out of CE devices right now. But and Palm, people wanted to use the Palm, and therefore Microsoft couldn't force people to use the device they wanted to. I just wrote a recent story about. I'm very involved in broadband issues right now because the idea of a high-speed access is a big deal now because Wall Street's interested in it. Although it's only used by less than 1 million people, the impact is considered to be large within the next 10 years. The stakes are very high for companies like AOL and AT&T and the rest of them because the idea is who is going to deliver broadband services, which could be either through DSL, which is high-speed telephone lines, through cable, which AT&T owns like a lot of cable now. It's not a telephone company, it's a cable company now. Or else through wireless means or through satellite. I think for a company like AOL, it's the critical juncture for them because they have to be on these broadband devices. They have to be delivered through broadband devices. AT&T knows this and therefore is trying to choke them by keeping them away from broadband devices and away from getting delivered through the cable modems. So what AOL has done is two things. One is to legally try to challenge AT&T all over the country, which I assume it's going to come here at some point. but they're trying to open cable systems all across the country. They just didn't lose in San Francisco, but they didn't win. But they did win in Portland and in Broward County, Florida, which is now trying to require AT&T to open their systems, which AT&T is legally challenging in court. The second way AOL is trying to get through is by striking deals with telephone companies to deliver DSL service with AOL on top of it, which they've been very successful at. They bought a big stake in Hughes Satellite so they can deliver AOL via satellite. Their aim is to deliver this service anywhere they can at all. It's also the aim of Yahoo. It's also the aim of Excite at home, which is controlled by AT&T. It's the aim of everybody to be able to get every little thing anywhere you are, any piece of information at any time. And
Okay.
you know, it's a big job. I think it's going to be kind of interesting. Well, all right, they have the brand. You know, most people are using AOL to get to the internet now. No matter how you slice it, they really do deliver the most people in terms of interactive services. They have the brand on their side, which is not an insignificant thing. At the same time, Yahoo is growing rather strongly, but Yahoo doesn't have delivery systems. As you know, Yahoo, you've got to go to Yahoo. It's like a really popular restaurant that everybody likes. And the issue for Yahoo is, what if they start building highways over their street? What if they start blocking exits? What if they can't get, if it's harder to get, if there's like 2 more clicks to get to Yahoo, do you go, oh, I'll just use this Excite thing? You know what I mean? That's the real question. I don't know.
Any other question? Anyone else?
Questions?
No, that's it.
Yeah, I have a question, I guess, about perspective. When you're chronicling the life and times of Silicon Valley, or Bill Gates, or Stephen Chase, do you tend to get sucked into this world perhaps a little more than you would like to, and find yourself almost obsessing about certain features or aspects? And secondly, also perspective, do you step back and look at this valley or this community, the sociology of this place, and compare it, say, to Rome or you know, other places in the world that
Rome today,
that have
or
different values and different ways of life?
I think
perhaps cell phones are more interesting in Italy than here.
Although everybody has a cell phone now.
Yeah, I mean, I think typical for journalists is you get excited by an idea and you just dive in and dive down deep and you become the story and you start kind of picking up the lingo that everyone's using. Do the dogs eat the dog food? They're just going to sniff around the bowl and, you know, skin the game. And I just kind of like change my whole vocabulary. But then the challenge is to gain perspective. I mean, to me, too many of the stories coming out of Silicon Valley, like hero worship, it's, you know, there's exciting things going on, but, you know, so much of software development just seems to me people working around the clock and not really breaking new ground, but just, even though they talk about it as we're changing the world, it's just, you know, how to more efficiently count people coming to the website and all. And it just strikes me as this great land grab that's about a lot of people wanting to make a lot of money, and there's nothing wrong with it. What I mind is that they make it into this noble thing. You mentioned Rome. People in Silicon Valley compare them, you know, you hear people say this is the Athens of the information age, this is Rome. I had one guy, Gary Reback, well-known lawyer in the, you know, anti-Microsoft movement, who said this is Mesopotamia, this is the crossing of the Tigris and the Euphrates. And, you know, I think of a place like Austin, and it's nowadays an idea is just as likely to come from here or Boston or anywhere as it is from Silicon Valley. I mean, it's this thing, to use one of the expressions I learned doing this book, was, you know, breathing their own fumes. And Silicon Valley, I think, at this point is full of themselves, and they don't really have a perspective on things.
It is difficult. As a reporter, it's incredibly difficult when you spend a gigantic amount of time with these people. On one side, they become humans. You know, they're not like cartoon characters, and you start to understand them and start to be part of the culture. I only got to Silicon Valley 2 years ago. I was living in Washington. But I definitely was disturbed the other day when I called someone and said, you know, I got to interface with you on this one. And I thought, oh my God. So, or I have to download that information. And I didn't mean into my computer, I meant into my brain. It's very hard when you're a reporter covering not to become part of the story in many ways. I actually when they ask me what I think, they think I actually have an opinion, and I'll go, oh, no, you shouldn't buy that. And I'm thinking, what am I saying? Oh, don't do that $1 billion deal because I feel like you should do this $1 billion deal. And you have to really step away, and I think probably not enough of that is done. But at the same time, in my opinion, what is happening here, it's not the Mesopotamia, it's different. It's another history. It is a historical event, what's happening with the internet. And if I can sit and talk with Jerry Yang or Jeff Bezos at the moment they're doing it, that has a historical significance, and someone should be writing it down. I mean, I think no reporter would turn down the chance to be sitting with Edison when he is making his decisions about the light bulb. They just wouldn't. Or be it in Hollywood in its early years. I think we've lost a lot of history, someone not seeing that and actually experiencing it with them. And I think it's really critical that we take note of this time, because I think years from now, many people are going to want to know how it happened. I look at the book that was very successful this year, Titan, which was based on interviews with John D. Rockefeller when he was older. I think it's invaluable to understand him. And it has a lot of echoes to today. And so we try not to, but we definitely should probably. Right after this, I'm going to Mexico, where there's this place. I actually found it on the internet, which has it's solar powered, no electricity. My cell phone will not, they assured me, will not work there.
She's going to explode. That's my prediction.
It's true.
What's going to happen over the next 5 years? Kara Swisher is going to explode in 4 days.
But I definitely think we can. It's a little bit crazy in Silicon Valley. And just Master and Poe, I went back to Washington after 2 years. After 2 years of being in Silicon Valley, and I was like urging all my friends to start up something. Start up something right now. And I realized I was insane.
I think the hardest thing is where you have to keep your perspective about is not just the lingo and the hottest new business deal or the hottest new feature, but is around the money. Meaning, we are writers, we take primarily a vow of poverty in some form, and we cannot invest in these companies, and yet we spend time with billionaires or people who just made $10 million who are making $150 an hour or something. I don't have a reporter's training by background. I'm not very good at asking the very difficult questions for people, but what I think I do have is what I call green vision, sort of like night vision, but rather than being able to see in the dark, I can see past the 9 zeros. I think that I got this when I had come out of college in 1986, 1987, and I was working on a taxable fixed income sales desk at the investment bank of First Boston Corporation, and $1 billion a day was going through my fingertips. And when you've traded at the age of 22 $1 billion a day, someone coming up and being a billionaire, just sort of like, that's just a day's work, my whole way of life. And so it's very important just to not, I have that. People who I talk to kind of tell me, they say, a lot of reporters come in here and they just see all my money and they can't see me. And you come in and somehow you don't make me feel weird about even my own money. I feel more comfortable with my own money having you around. And it's kind of a weird thing. I have a sort of accountant's clinical calm that has this sort of makes it disappear for a while.
You do have to ignore the money. I mean, when the other day, this guy, he just made $150 million. He was dying to tell me. And I was like, yeah, 150, whatever. It's like not a lot of money. And you have to. There's a reporter who just got in a big trouble for trading, for buying stock. It's a very well-known reporter in Silicon Valley. She bought friends and family stock, and then she flipped it, and she was fired for that.
In a way, it's easy to see beyond the money because it's just so absurd. I mean, if you put John D. Rockefeller's money into 1999 dollars, he would have been worth $13.5 billion. You look at Microsoft's 3 richest owners, and Gates is up at about 90 billion. Paul Allen, I forget, somewhere 40 billion. And Steve Ballmer, the poorest of the bunch, is worth nearly twice as much as Rockefeller. I mean, so it's just like, I don't know, what is the difference between 100 million, a billion, or 100 billion? I mean, at a certain point, you just never have to work another day of your life. And I just look at a lot of these folks, and it's like, why don't you invest in a money market? And Bill Gates, if he did that, could live off $5 billion a year in interest. Let it go.
They work like dogs. I mean, they have billions, and they work all the time. And it's, I mean, again, we joke we would have been gone $20 billion ago, but they really do. Is there any other questions? I think we have time for 1 or 2 more.
My question is, I've always, segueing from that last question, I've always been interested in the influence of big money in politics and elections. And I can envision a future where we vote online. Like they had an article in the paper a couple of days ago that Americans want to like do their laundry online.
You can't do that.
I want to eat online.
They want to do everything online. So we might be, like in a couple of years, voting online. And I wanted to ask two questions. But the first one would be, what do you think of, would you feel good voting online?
I feel great. I think it'd get more people to vote if it does. I mean, right now they're doing a lot of polling all of a sudden online. AOL just signed a big deal with Foot Cone. Yeah, I think people have more of a tendency to do things like that, and if it could be done in an honest way without
Do you think
fraud.
that it's very in jeopardy? I mean, you're talking about these companies and these people who are online who have billions of dollars of loose capital to spend to influence the distribution and what you see and what ads you see and what placement you see on these issues, and whether it's for candidates or whether it's for issues.
Well, I think that I don't know much about campaign law, but I think any way people can vote, I think they should vote. I don't think people vote in this country nearly enough, and if online is going to get them to vote, if bringing an ice cream cone to every single person is going to make them vote, I think that's great.
Exactly. Any other questions? Oh,
Over here.
you're right here.
Over here.
You talked about the success of these internet companies, but are any of them successful in the way that a Microsoft or a Dell is successful? They have huge market capitalizations, but are any of them really in a situation where they have continuing and growing profits that are anything like justification for their market capitalizations?
Only two internet companies that are significant internet companies are profitable: America Online and Yahoo, and they're not that profitable. I mean, they're pretty profitable, and the trend is upward for them. And it's increasingly upward because they're based on advertising, which is a tremendously lucrative way to make money, because it's like 90% margins. So no, they don't make profits in any kind of ways. And the big joke is every time Amazon loses $100 million, Jeff Bezos is worth another $1 billion. So people are thinking that this is a time not to make money. It's a time to build markets, and that if they stop marketing, they could make money. The question is, can they actually stop marketing without growing? So I mean, it's all. I wouldn't be making money right now if I was running an internet company, because it would mean that I wasn't investing in things that need to be built. It's like railroads; you have to build them before people can use them, and then you make money on it, presumably.
Yeah, but there was an obvious way to make money off of railroads. You'd charge people to ride them. I mean, there are some huge question marks, and I don't doubt some companies will be very, very profitable, but I also don't doubt some companies worth a whole lot in market cap won't be, because will advertising work? Maybe. I mean, sure, it's got a high profit margin, but if no one's going to buy it, it doesn't really make a difference. So we are in the infancy of this, and I mean, there's huge question marks around the kind of issues you raise.
I have one comment. This kind of goes overall to the subtext of the conversation we've had tonight. We've talked about Bill Gates' money, and we've talked about venture capital money, and we've talked about too money being in startups. We've talked about how we resist money. We've talked about whether these companies have insane valuations without profits. It's the money issues. The fiber of what I see in the startup culture and in successful companies in Silicon Valley, and I'm sure it is equally true here, is not about money. Money is so ubiquitous that it is not an issue. What everyone is thinking about, what every startup is focused on to an extreme, is getting more people. And Silicon Valley is so crowded. I mean, it's such a dot-com place that every billboard is from some startup that just launched, taking out 60-foot wide billboards, one after another, as you go down the freeway, and they're not you're not pushing Coke on billboards, because the dot-coms will outspend Coca-Cola for that billboard space. And you can't go to a movie in Silicon Valley without the ads before the movie coming up with jobs. You go to the news racks on the free weeklies are stuffed with full-page ads for jobs in Silicon Valley. So it's this perverse situation where the freeways are clogged, the apartment complexes are full, the office parks are full, yet And it seems like there's so many people yet every company wants more people, more people, more people. And if you can find people, you can get funding. So it's really a story where people, that's what's actually fascinating for me to have watched this happen, is where the money's just it doesn't really matter. What matters is finding really good people. And that's ultimately reassuring to me. And I want to say that because it's easy to look and say it's all about money and feel this distrust for us. Not. Right now, it's all about finding good people.
You know, Poe and I cover some of the same ground, and it's funny, we always disagree about this because, I mean, I look at Silicon Valley and there's all these little Bill Gateses running around talking about ubiquity and owning and dominating and killing and destroying and all that. And, you know, it's not about the money. Sure, I hear that all the time, but, you know, they've got a poster of Porsche above their head, or they drive away in their $250,000 Lamborghini and all, or it's not about the money, and then they tell me their dream is to retire by 30. So in homage to Molly Ivins, who I adore, I'll say, like, why is it the only time you hear it's never about money is that person is worth at least $1 million or more? I mean, you know, of course it's not about the money if you got money, but...
But in that term, in terms of Dell, for example, some people question whether they shouldn't spend more money on the internet and stop worrying so much about profits, because the internet's going to be a significant threat to, you know, free PCs. Should Dell be more involved, for example, in services? I know they've just announced a number of initiatives. That's going to cost them, and I think their profitability is going to suffer for it. And a lot of people get penalized on Wall Street for not spending at this moment in time, because, you know, because if you don't get it now, you're not going to get it later, kind of thing.
Should we do one last question?
One last question. Anybody else? Do you have, go ahead right there.
When does it all end?
Never.
When the world ends.
Yeah, when does television end? When does radio end? When does...
Well, there's this, you know, the big bubble is building up. Maybe it's not a bubble, but maybe it is. What's going to be the reaction in Silicon Valley when the stock prices get cut in half from that, and
Right.
they're not worth $1 billion anymore?
Well, you know what? They have the money, actually. They went public. Drugstore.com just walked away with $120 million in cash, which they now have in their bank account, and it's not in internet stocks. Amazon raised $1.2 billion in cash in a debt offering. I think the stock market sort of obscures what's going on, is that the gigantic amount of investment is being put into this thing. What's going to happen is a lot of these companies are going to fold into other companies, and hopefully before they drop off the face of the earth. This has happened several times already. So the big companies are just going to get bigger and hopefully jump to the next ice flow. I mean, that's the theory, is that they can do that. AOL is the prime example of this. Everyone thought this was going to blow up, this company, every time. And they had a charge that they had for marketing. It was $360 million that they hit. They didn't hide. It was sitting there on their balance sheet. But they had never been profitable, but it seemed as if they were profitable because they moved a number of expenses off the balance sheet. They declared themselves, they took a charge in 1996, I think it was, and it was right for them to do that at the time. But they just kept jumping from one ice flow to the next, and, you know, they made it to solid ground. And I think that's the idea, is that these investments will build businesses, and then the build businesses will really be businesses. And the weak ones, of course, as usual, as the way humanity is, will die, and the strong ones will be stronger.
I do think we will have crashes. I think crashes are inevitable. At some point, the money flow has to stop. The demand can't be infinite. But what do those crashes look like? Well, you could argue that in April and May of this past spring, we had quite a crash. Internet stock valuations were down 50%. They're down by half. And yet we're still having this conversation this summer. A lot of them are up again. They still haven't reached those highs. But
They're down again.
And they're down again. You could say that the stock market and the internet stocks lost their value by half. You'd call that a crash, wouldn't you? But what I saw in Silicon Valley during that time was, in fact, the pace of entrepreneurial activism pick up significantly. You saw during that period of time all these people who had been at their internet company, their .com, that was fun when it was a startup, and now it's a 500-person company, and they feel like it's gotten very bureaucratic, and they're watching their stock at all the time and how many options they're going to invest and when they're going to invest, and thinking, how much money do I have to make that house payment? When can I jump and do my own thing? Or when can I jump and do the startup? And those golden handcuffs, the value went down, and they said, all right, heck with the golden handcuffs. I'm going to go do my own thing anyway. So you saw a tremendous amount of startups get funded during that very same period of time that stocks were going down. So if you think that just because stocks are going down, young people are going to stop forming their own companies, you're dead wrong.
Well, no, we're not going to take any more questions. So thank you everyone for coming. It's a great crowd to have here, and I hope it was good.
We have some books over here for sale. If anyone wants to buy a book and get it autographed, we can take checks and credit cards up here. And other than that, if you want to, if you already have your book, if you want to just come line up, if you want to personalize, we'll write your name